it's important to note that stand-up comedy, as we know it today, is really purely an originally American art form. It is really akin to jazz in that it is an art form that sprung from the American experience. I mean, when people started getting on stage in the context of a comedy and entertainment and actually started as comedians to say, you know what I think about this thing, that was really revolutionary. That was really remarkable. I mean, as Larry Miller put it on an episode of the Green Room, he goes, imagine doing that in 1930s in Spain. You know what I think? You don't. So it's born of the very American embracing of freedom of speech, challenging, government and policy and all that sort of stuff, and also actually has its genesis to a huge, massively significant degree in the immigrant experience. So stand-up comedy, as we know it today, is as uniquely American an art form as jazz is. And what's interesting is just like when jazz fell out of favor in the 60s and 70s, jazz artists went around the world where they were revered and they were getting the kind of accolades and the kind of attention and the kind of audiences that they never got even in their heyday here in America. So overseas sort of almost recognizes stand-up comedy as much more of an art form than the average audience here does. I think that it is a really overlooked and underrated art form. I mean, I believe that stand-up comedy is the most complicated and the most complex and the richest art form out there. I mean, really, if you think about all the things that a stand-up has to deal with, or not even a stand-up, even comedy writers, whatever, but if you think of all the elements that have to be considered and what comes into play, these weird sort of undefinable kinds of relationships with an audience and what's going on in people's heads and what the vibe of the room is, all those things that become so key to the experience of live comedy, they don't matter as much in any other art form. The complexities of how an audience will receive your work as a comedian, not dealt with in any other art form. Stand-up comedy is the only art form, and I don't know how this happened, but it's the only art form where its mere existence gets to be decided by the recipient. If somebody sits back and thinks, you know what, that's not funny, that's not comedy, nobody can listen to crap music and go, that's not music. They can go, I don't like it, but nobody reads a bad book and goes, that's not a great novel. That's not even a book. Nobody looks at an awful painting and goes, that's not a painting. They may say it's not art, it's not good, whatever, but they don't actually determine its existence. And stand-up comedy is the only art form where that's true. And another thing that's interesting about stand-up comedy is in every other art form, the entire range of human emotion and experience is fodder. Emotions A through Z are completely acceptable to explore in any other art form. But for some reason in stand-up comedy, the audience seems to feel like only emotions A through M are appropriate here, and N through Z you can't talk about. And that's where you get the most forward-moving and artful comedians are going through to N to Z, So there's all sorts of things that we as artists in comedy have to deal with that no other art form ever has to consider. And we have to do it and do all the math in our heads, moment by moment, constantly, all the time. And also, I believe that if you want to know anything about a particular culture at any point in time, if you look at their comedy, you'll know everything you need to know. It's also, as Carlin used to call it, a vulgar art form. Vulgar meaning of the people. That stand-up comedy communicates to everybody, lowest common denominator to the most sophisticated aristocracy. Most other art forms suffer from being elitist. Who goes to opera? How many people are going to get communicated to through opera? Theater, even the most forward-moving theater, is $35 a ticket. So you've already eliminated the audience that you're going to reach and how your ideas are going to get out there. So stand-up comedy is a really profoundly important art form that speaks volumes. And I always wondered why there is no comedy appreciation course in universities, or why there is no, why comedy is never explored in the way that literature is explored. And I'll tell you right now, I think that any Stephen Wright line you choose is brilliant haiku and deserves all the respect and all the analysis and all the poetic, inspection of the greatest haiku in the world.
I mean, that actually does sound like a tremendous class. I mean, it's also one of those things where it's like, how come comedies are never nominated for Oscars? You know, like how come great comedic actors are never nominated? And
here's the interesting flip on that is that when that happens, comedy will suffer.
Because it'll start taking itself too seriously or something, or
people that are going into it will start taking it too seriously, whatever the case may be. So it's a kind of double-edged sword. It's a thing that I fight for all the time, but I fight for people to think that way about comedy, to be open to being moved by it because it might actually be something meaningful, not just pop culture fluff. So I would like individuals to look at it more as potentially valuable and meaningful in their lives, but I don't want that to happen institutionally.